Hi, everyone. If I may have your attention. Well, thanks, everybody, for coming. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Paul Capdevila, who will be our guest speaker today. I'm going to briefly do a summary of his CV. Paul Capdevila is a lecturer at the University of Barcelona working on the impacts of global change on biodiversity. His work aims to better understand and predict the resilience of natural systems to global change, to develop effective management and conservation tools. To do that, he combines the use of small-scale experiments, field data, large-scale data, together with a wide variety of modeling techniques. Paul started his research at the University of Barcelona, getting involved in several long-term monitoring programs in several Mediterranean marine reserves, such as Medes in Catalan, Islands, Portcross National Park, and Cap de Creu. His PhD was supervised by Dr. Cristina Linares and Dr. Bernard Hereu, where he focused on understanding the natural dynamics of a deep-water Mediterranean seaweed species, Cystoceira zosteroides, and their resilience to global change. After his PhD, Paul gained a Ramon Areces Fellowship to do his first postdoc at the Department of Zoology, University of Oxford, between 2018 and 2020, where he combined large data sets and modeling tools to better understand what determines the resilience of a species. Next, he gained a research associate position at the School of Biological Sciences, University of Bristol, 2020-2022, where he studied the impacts of multiple stressors on vertebrate populations worldwide. Finally, in 2022, he gained a Maria Zambrano and a Marie Curie Fellowship to work at the Department of Evolutionary Biology, Ecology, and Environmental Sciences at the University of Barcelona. And then in 2023, finally, he got a lecturer position in the same department. Well, the floor is yours, so please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Anna and Rob, for the organization and all the amazing thing you have behind. I feel really honored to be here today. I really like museums, and natural science museums in particular. I think they tell our stories and how we relate it with nature in the past and the present, and some hints to the future. And who doesn't like a great story, right? As Anna mentioned, now I'm a lecturer at the University of Barcelona, and I have the very bad habit of asking questions to the audience. I'm really sorry. I hope you don't mind interacting a little bit with me. And I'm really sorry for the people following online. So, have you ever heard of storylines or plot lines or the concept of universal narratives? Yes? Can you raise your hand? I'm not going to evaluate. Oh, a lot of people. Damn, I hope to surprise you today. Anyway, so a fiction writer called Kurt Vonnegut, he proposed that every great story follows several storylines. One of them is the Cinderella storyline, where our protagonist starts really bad, and then something good happens, and then it achieves a good fortune, good happiness. But again, a turning event happens to this person, or this protagonist, and everything goes down. But after a period of misery, there is another turning point, and things go up again very well with the potential of infinite happiness. And this is the Cinderella story, which you might have heard of. Another storyline is the good news, bad news. And this one feels pretty much the research life plotline, where good events are often, compensated, or maybe compensated is not the word, by bad events. So our protagonist always feels that good things and bad things happen to him or her, or them. And this plot line, for instance, would be the story of Jurassic Park, or Hamlet, for instance, if you are more classic. And then another familiar plot line is from bad to worse. And I think this one is pretty self-explanatory. And I see by the reactions that I don't need to explain it very much. Some movies that follow this storyline would be the recent movie of Don't Look Up in Netflix. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend it. But also would be, for instance, Requiem for a Dream, where things go from bad to worse. Okay. When I first read about this, I'm obviously an ecologist and very close to being ignorant about storytelling. But when I saw this, I realized that this reminded me a little bit of my own research. Does these trends, any of these trends, remind you of something? To me, they remind me of what the current state of nature is undergoing. And as you might have heard, when I move these floor cracks, I'm going to move here, sorry. So you know, you may have heard that we are under a massive biodiversity crisis. And things seem to be going from bad to worse. But some people argue that we are now in a junction, a window of opportunity, where the decisions that we make today might determine the future conditions of the state of nature. And in this seminar, I want to argue that a concept that we have used for a long time in ecology, resilience, might hold the key to help us to turn up this narrative. So this talk will be structured in what I call 3 acts. First, I'm going to discuss why we need the concept of resilience. Then I'm going to introduce you the concept a little bit more and how I think we can make it useful for ecology and conservation. And finally, I will try to give you some guidelines to apply it to your own research if this is something you want. But because I know that in every movie, everyone skips the credits, unless you are a Marvel fan, I know. I wanted to first mention that all the research I'm going to present today has been developed thanks to the collaboration with students, mentors, members of my group, and a lot of collaborators that they didn't fit in this screen, and a bunch of funding agencies. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for these people here. So let's get started. This picture is the first picture that we have of our home. It was taken in the Christmas Eve of 1968 by astronauts in Apollo 8, and it represents our home. This is us. And this is our storyline. These represent the geological information that we have, or the most approximate information that we have about the variation of temperature or environmental conditions that we had in our planet. And as you can see, conditions on Earth were pretty rough at the beginning. Then it was followed by a period of glaciations. And then I would really like you to pay attention to this particular period, geological epoch, the Holocene. This epoch represented an unprecedented stability in terms of environmental conditions variation. And this stability allowed us to develop as society, as humans. We transitioned from hunter-gatherers to agriculture to modern societies today. But we decided that in 1950, I wasn't involved in that decision, but it was decided that we transition to a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, where we acknowledge us, humans, as a major driving force of nature. And it's based on the overwhelming evidence that our socio-economic development over the past decades has been paralleled by a modification of the environmental conditions that had been in place on our planet for 10,000 years. But how this alteration of environmental condition has influenced biodiversity? Well, we know that species are going extinct, and therefore we might assume that biodiversity is in decline. However, you might have heard that there is a lot of debate of whether biodiversity is actually at local scale being lost or it's simply changing. And at the center of this debate is this graph that you have here. This is the Global Living Planet Index. It uses data on vertebrate population time series, which starts from the 1970s to current dates. And this index argues that we have lost about 70% of the abundance of wildlife populations. However, a lot of scientists have argued that this index doesn't actually quantify appropriately the changes of wildlife abundance. And some argue that it's an inflated measure, and some people say that it's not. Well, it has sparked a lot of controversy. But to put a bit of order on why this index was not functioning and why it wasn't capturing the reality of the state of wildlife abundance, in this manuscript led by a postdoc, Thomas Johnson, from the University of Sheffield, what we proposed was a new statistical framework to quantify changes in biodiversity abundance over time. I'm not going to go in detail on the statistical framework. If you want, I have some slides in case you have specific questions. I didn't know if it was going to be of the interest of you. But basically what we did, we proposed that when we study biodiversity change or abundance change over larger scales, we need to account for correlative effects. So the effects of temporal correlation, spatial correlation, and phylogenetic correlation. And we applied this statistical framework to the major biodiversity data sets out there. And what we saw, so please focus just on these yellow lines, the other ones are previous approaches. Well, we basically saw that the uncertainty of our biodiversity changes increased a lot. And if we focus on the Living Planet database, which is the one where the Living Planet Index is based on, we can see this massive uncertainty around this potential decline. So what this is telling us, if I was doing my PhD based on this, I would say, my model is wrong. I need to fit another model, right? We have all been there.
Abundance is abundance of what?
Abundance of individuals of a population.
But animals or?
Animals, sorry. Vertebrate species, mostly, sorry. So, yes, if I had done this during my PhD, probably during my postdoc, I would have thought this model must be wrong. It's giving me a lot of uncertainty. It's not significant. We discard it. But actually, I want to argue that this is what reflects the truth. And it's that we actually don't know how the magnitude, we know the direction, but we don't know the magnitude of biodiversity change. And we need to acknowledge this uncertainty. Another factor that the Living Planet Index so far has neglected is the fact that, as I said before, in the Anthropocene, populations and species are exposed to what we call threats or stressors, depending on the school you think you are. And these threats are broadly categorized in in major boxes, let's say. One would be habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, climate change, exploitation, or disease. And these threats are impacting population in isolation, but also in combination with other threats. But the Living Planet Index doesn't account for this when modeling. So in this manuscript, what we did, we again used this data set, the Living Planet database, but complemented with data about which threats were impacting these populations at the time of the study. Once again, the Living Planet database contains information of abundance of individuals, of populations, of different vertebrate species, that is, amphibians, birds, mammals, fishes, and reptiles. And again, we had information about which threats were impacting these populations at the time of the study. And what we saw was that actually most of the populations were impacted by habitat loss and exploitation. But we also had information about those populations that were not exposed to threats, which is very important as well. And we were not surprised to see this because habitat loss and exploitation are very directly linked to human activities. We applied the same statistical framework presented by Tom in the previous paper to explore the effects of these threats on the population trends of these vertebrate species. Here you have the singular threats when the threats were not interacting with any other threats, and here you have the effects of the interaction. So when, for instance, exploitation was impacting together with climate change, let's say. I'm going to focus for simplicity on the singular threats, but I'm happy to discuss the other ones afterwards. So basically what we saw, here you have posterior distributions of these threats, where the effect, if it falls on the left side of the zero, it means that it has a negative effect. If it falls on the right, it means that it has a positive effect. What we see is that for populations not exposed to any threat, there is a massive uncertainty. Again, this uncertainty that we were saying before. But surprisingly to us, when we were seeing that, well, unsurprisingly, when populations are exposed to threats, they are in decline. But what did surprise us is that these threats, climate change, disease, and invasive species, are the ones having a more negative effects on our population trends. And why I'm saying this, that we were surprised? First, because, as you know, or you might know, most of global conservation policies are focused on habitat loss and exploitation. And it makes sense. They have been historically very present, and they are very prevalent. So you might say, well, case solved. Now, to reverse biodiversity loss, we just need to focus on this. Simple, right? Well, we wanted to explore whether this could be the case. And using the same models, we explored what we call a counterfactual scenario. So what we were doing, we were taking this data with their threats, and we were removing the effects of these different threats. So we were removing the effect of disease and its interaction with other threats, which is important. Disease, pollution, invasive species, climate change, habitat loss, exploitation, and all the combination of these threats. The first thing that we notice is that when we remove these threats, the only threats that were actually seeing a relatively strong signal of shift on the population trend, so we were seeing some effects reversing this decline, was for climate change, habitat loss, and exploitation. And the only threat that was actually, to some extent, reversing or at least stabilizing the population trends of these vertebrates was removing exploitation. But the most important thing is that the only way to flip these negative trends into positives was removing the interactions of these multiple threads. So, to answer this broad question, is biodiversity in decline? I would say yes, but biodiversity trends are highly uncertain, and I'm going to insist on this. I do think that we need to acknowledge these uncertainties, because to manage biodiversity, we need to know local patterns rather than global patterns. We need to account for the impacts of threats, because they are associated with the strongest declines. And only addressing multiple threats, we will be able to reverse these biodiversity loss. And you might be here and say, but this guy wasn't supposed to talk about resilience? And I'm going to say yes, but I want to argue that some conservationists or managers would tell you, okay, let's remove all the threats. No? Now we know what to do. Let's just stop exploitation. It's not that simple. Human societies, we need to survive as well. We need to develop. So removing threats is not as simple. If we want to continue to thrive, to live in developed societies, the threats are going to continue to be there. So a lot of the biodiversity research has switched from removing threats to managing resilience, the natural capacity of systems to withstand these threats. And for instance, there are many international conservation policies and targets that specifically mention resilience, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. But I wanted to pause here again. I actually don't know how, I have plenty of time. Again, I'm going to need interaction. This will feel really miserable if we don't interact, so please. Can I ask you, could you raise your hands if you have ever mentioned in any of your papers, project proposals, or maybe talks, the word resilience? Aha! Here you are. Okay, it's fine. Now, for all of you, also the ones that didn't raise their hands, I know you didn't do it because you are a bit shy. Let's imagine two species, this whale and this bird. Again, by a show of hands, how many of you think that the whale is larger in size than the bird? Okay, well, that was difficult, right? Okay, now, how many of you think that the bird lives longer than the whale? Ah, very well. I thought this one was more difficult, but yeah, you got it right. And now, how many of you think that the whale is more resilient than the bird? Not so easy, right? The truth is, we don't know. And actually, I formulated the question a bit tricky. I didn't mention resilient to what. But in any case, it is surprising that resilience has been a concept in ecology and in conservation for many years. We have it in our conservation policies and management plans, and we are still not able to tell whether a species is more resilient than another or a system is more resilient than another. And this is the reason to be of this seminar. I'm going to tell you what is my point of view on how we can make it more useful. The concept of resilience, or the first written evidence that we have of it, was coined by the physician James Carson in 1819, which was describing or was using resilience to describe the capacity of lungs to expand and contract. And it didn't take a lot of time for other scientific disciplines to incorporate the concept of resilience. But it took many decades through ecology to incorporate it. And one of the first mentions that we know of was by Cowford Holling in 1973, who defined it as a measure of persistence of systems and their ability to absorb change and disturbance and still maintain the same relationships between populations or state variables. Quite a definition, right? This definition came at a time when ecologists like Bob May or Robert MacArthur were introducing the concept of stability and the stability of systems to withstand change or disturbance. But the definition of Holling, unfortunately, was so unclear that what happened is that it emerged or it divided the field into two subdisciplines, the discipline of stability and the discipline of resilience. But what actually Holling was trying to do is to say, hey, resilience is a property of stability. And again, this was a real mess, and it sparked a lot of debate among ecologists that we define resilience in very different ways. And what happens is that when we define it in very different ways, we also quantify it in very different ways. And what this means is that when we try to compare the resilience of a whale against one of a bird, it's very difficult to compare because we have defined it and quantified it in very different ways. And this is distancing us from conservation and management. To put a bit of order to this mess, in March of 2020, we organized this special feature across several journals of the British Ecological Society, where we compiled contributions from different authors, which we wanted them to tell us how they were defining resilience, how they were quantifying it, and how they were comparing it. And I can tell you we had a lot of submissions, 29 made the cut, and among those 29 contributions, I can tell you we had almost 29 different definitions of resilience. So, to contribute a bit to harmonize the field, in this manuscript we made some recommendations that I'm going to put you at the end of the presentation, but we also highlighted some challenges and opportunity for the field of resilience to move forward. And I'm going to show you how I tried to address them with my own research. The first important thing is that we need to conceptualize and quantify resilience in a meaningful way for ecology. I'm sure that you came to this talk here expecting me to show you a stability landscape with a ball and cup and transitioning between states. I have no problem with that framework. But sometimes, empirical ecologists, we need specifics. We need things that we can go to the field and measure. And sometimes I find that there is a disagreement between the theory and our empirical data. So what I want to suggest is that we need to use or develop frameworks that allow us to quantify resilience using empirical data. And as an example, I'm going to show you how we did for demography. What we did was to borrow theory from ecology, resilient theory, and we tried to translate it into concepts that we have in demography. Our definition of resilience, or our approach to resilience, is based on the School of Engineering Resilience. I'm not going to enter into this, but basically it assumes that resilience is the result of two processes: resistance and recovery. And again, we translated this into concepts that we can measure in population ecology or demography. So how did we do that? Imagine that we have a population of whatever, the whale, and we measure its size over time. If we don't disturb this population, we would expect it to have a trajectory like this, more or less stable. If you have empirical data, you know it's never a flat. It does like this. But it fluctuates around a stability point. If we disturb this system, and here we define disturbance as an alteration of the proportion of individuals of different sizes, different classes, or different ages. So it alters the structure of my population. We know that the population will go under what we call a transient period. A period where its population growth is not going to be stable over time. And here many things can happen. I'm going to show you the two extreme situations. One thing that can happen is that the population increases. And I know a lot of people say, population increase after a disturbance? If you are a forest researcher, you won't be surprised. Maybe when you cut a forest, sometimes, because the release of resources, you have a sprouting. So in terms of size, not biomass, in terms of size, we see an increase of the population. But if we wait long enough, we would expect the population to undergo again into a stability period again. The other extreme situation that can happen, you can imagine, is that the population decreases over time, and if it doesn't collapse, we expect it to, and if we don't disturb it further, it will reach again a stability point.
Sorry, so what does it mean, disturbance?
Disturbance is an alteration of the population structure. So the proportion of individuals of different sizes, different ages, or classes. Yes?
You think that you have some way to do that?
Sorry?
And you imagine that you have some way to do that, or some stressor or whatever?
Yes. When you have a disturbance, usually, disturbances here as pulse disturbances, they unbalance your population, right? You have a stable structure, and this disturbance can affect, I don't know, the germlings or the cubs of the whale more than the adults. So this unbalances the structure.
Of the distribution of the different
Exactly.
population size is the total distribution.
The- Ah. I go ahead? Yes? Keep that for the end. Okay, so in these scenarios, anything can happen in between these two extreme scenarios, okay? I'm just showing you the two extreme ones. And actually, in demography, we have tools to measure these extremes compared to what would have happened if the population hadn't been disturbed and it had remained under stable growth. And this allows us to quantify what we call the components of resilience. The first one, and this is a new one that we haven't seen, is called compensation, which is the ability of a population to increase after a disturbance. And again, this is not very commonly seen in resilience literature, but it's very common in natural systems, so we wanted to reflect it. Another one that we have already seen is resistance. The more I decline after a disturbance, the less resilient I am, the less resistant I am. And then we can measure the length of this transient period, which equals to the time of recovery. So why this is important? Demography, the study of the vital rate of populations, actually is a science that allows us to compare the very same processes among different species. All species, to some extent, survive, reproduce, and growth. And if we have this quantified, then we can quantify these very same resilient components, and then this allows us to compare. And this allows us to tell whether a species is more resistant than another, whether a population is less, compensates less for a disturbance. So once we have the means to quantify resilience, we can actually start to ask very interesting questions, such as what makes my system resilient or a species resilient? Resilience is an emergent property of the systems, and it depends on different processes, such as compensation, resistance, time of recovery. So understanding how these components are related to each other and what determines the fact that a species is more resistant than another can allow us to anticipate how my system will respond to certain disturbances. And this is precisely what we addressed in this manuscript, where we used 2 worldwide data sets of hundreds of populations of animals and plants in the form of what we call matrix population models, Leslie models, Lefkowitz models. And what we did was to quantify these very same resilience components across animals and plants. I'm going to show you the results only for animals here because, let's face it, people like more animals than plants, right? But we do have the results for plants, so if you are interested, we can discuss it. They are very much the same. So what we did was to relate these components of demographic resilience in this case. What we saw is that species that are more resistant to disturbances recover more quickly from them. It makes sense. If you don't drop a lot, you recover quicker. Then resistance was also negatively correlated with compensation. So species that compensate a lot are often less resistant. And finally, we observed that populations that compensate a lot, to some extent, take longer to recover. What is happening here? That when we have these populations that increase a lot their size after a disturbance, they remain in this transient period for longer. And this is very important because during this transient period, it can also happen that the population drops again. So broadly, what this is telling us is that the components of resilience are to some extent related to each other. So when we know just one of them, we can, to some extent, infer the others. But also, again, we wanted to know which characteristics of my species are determining these components of resilience. And what we did was to relate all these components of resilience with different life history characteristics. And I'm not showing you the bunch of life history traits that we tested. I'm going to show you the most relevant ones, or the easy to interpret ones. So first, generation time, which is an indicator of how long it takes a population to complete its life cycle. So it's an indicator of whether you are a very slow species or a very fast species. And what we saw is that there is no clear relationship with resistance, which we were very surprised with, but we saw that there is a positive relationship with recovery time. And this is not surprising because the longer it takes you to complete your life cycle, the longer it takes you to recover from a disturbance. And finally, the other trait that we explored was mean reproductive output, so the number of offsprings that you produce as an average individual, and it was negatively related with resistance. So the more offsprings you produce, the less resistant you are to disturbances. So what this was telling us is that actually by knowing a bit of the life history characteristics of my species, we can, to some extent, anticipate the response to disturbance. Okay. But when we know how to quantify resilience and how it emerges in our system, we can start also to ask more interesting questions, such as how does global change affects the resilience of my systems? And we, again, use this worldwide data set called the Living Planet Database. It's the very same one that I've presented before. But instead of identifying the type of disturbance that we had, we classified them between whether they were exposed to 0 threats, 1 threat, 2 threats at the same time, or 3. We call it the stressors because the reviewer asked us to call it the stressors. And we can discuss also the terminology afterwards. And what we did, remember that this is abundance of individuals over time. What we did was to use the previous framework of demographic resilience to decompose this abundance time series into resistance and recovery time series. Okay? And we measured their trend over time. What we expected was that these trends over time would be stable. So we wouldn't expect, if our populations are doing well, their capacity to resist or recover should remain stable over time. But what we saw is this. So here you have posterior distributions of a multi-level Bayesian model. And here on the x-axis, you have the temporal trend. Posterior distributions falling on the left. It means a negative trend of resistance on your left and recovery on your right. And here you have the number of stressors. And what we broadly see is that populations exposed to an increasing number of stressors have a sharper or a stronger decline on their resistance and recovery. So basically this. The more stressors we expose, or threats, I hope the reviewer is not in this room, the more threats we expose our populations to, the more quickly we lose resilience. Okay, so can resilience help to halt biodiversity loss? Well, I would argue we don't know. I would argue we are not there yet. You would say, this guy is a bullshitter. I came here hoping for this answer. Well, I don't have it. I do think resilience in ecology and conservation still has a long way to go. But now we know, for instance, that life history is an important indicator of resilience of a species. This is not something, and this is not rocket science. It's very intuitively. We also introduced this new concept, demographic resilience, which I hope you can use. And we also, again, show that multiple threats accelerate the loss of resilience, which also goes with the fact that multiple threats are accelerating the loss of biodiversity. So we still need to focus pretty much on this. Okay. So again, you are standing here looking at a guy that was supposed to make you rethink about resilience, but it told you that biodiversity trends are uncertain, resilience is not that useful. What should you take from this talk? Well, the title of this talk was, how can we make this resilience useful for ecology and management? So if you have a little attention span and you fell asleep today in this talk, or you thought, well, this guy, I can't stand, please pay attention to this. If you want to incorporate resilience into your research, this is the reason to be of this talk. So the first recommendation that I would say is pretty simple. Define resilience clearly. And you would say, wow, this is so obvious. Yeah, go and check the papers talking about resilience. It is a mess. So my recommendation is that use the existing frameworks. I don't care which ones. You can use the ecosystem resilience approach, engineering approach, but there are clear definitions out there, even for ecology. Also, all the systems that we are studying here, from genes to individuals to communities, all the study systems that we have some composition and structure. And they have measurable outcomes. Let's say genetic diversity, population size, richness of a community. And these things are measurable. So to translate this into resilience, the only thing that we need is to have these quantifications pre and post disturbance. When we have this data, I know it's difficult. We can discuss about it. But when we have this data, we can actually start talking about resilience. This one is very related to the previous one, the first one. We need to use standardized ways to measure resilience. Again, resilience is a very sexy concept, and it probably will help you to get that funding, but there are existing standardized measurement ways. So let's use them to be able to compare among our studies and speak the same language, use the same currency. And finally, which I haven't touched here, we need to specify the type of disturbance at which our systems are exposed to and to what they are being resilient to. This is the concept of resilience to what. It's not the same to be exposed to a press disturbance than to a pulse disturbance, to the ramp disturbance, the intensity, the frequency, etc., etc. These characteristics will determine the trajectory of my recovery or to whether I'm resistant or not. At the very beginning of this talk, which feels a long time ago, right? I mentioned that over the past 50 years, we have modified the conditions on Earth that were in place for the past 10,000 years, right? And I mentioned that some argue that we are now at a junction where what we do in the coming decades can determine the future of the state of nature. And I know it feels from bad to worse. I am there. But I would like to argue that the concept of resilience, and I really hope to have convinced you a bit, can help us to rebuild the state of nature and turn our narrative, again, from a bad to worse, to a Cinderella story. I know, it sounds quite naive, but forgive me, I always liked fairy tales. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thanks a lot, Paul. I really like your ending and the rest of the talk as well, of course. Now it's the turn for questions. So if anybody wants to ask something to Paul, we have some time.
Well, thank you for the talk. It was very nice. So, could you go to your definition? Could you go to the definition of resilience, to the cartoon that you plotted for a second?
Which cartoon, sorry?
The one where you put compensation and resistance and this. I think I missed.
This might take a while.
Yeah, it's almost at the beginning.
Nearly there. Here.
Okay. So I have one question. So in the compensation part, so the system now here, it goes from the initial steady state to a different one. So if you think of this as a resilience, should it not go back to the initial state? Because otherwise,
so you mean
is a
this
sort of,
part, right?
Yeah, this is a transition. And the same applies to the other one. I would imagine the resilience is actually going back to the initial state, otherwise it's a transition.
It's a very good point. I really like this question. Thank you. We are not defining here, and I didn't go into the specifics here. This has a lot of meat, actually. So I'm really glad to have the opportunity to clarify. We define the state depending on the population growth, nor its size. So what defines my state of the population is whether its population growth, it's constant over time, it's lambda. So that means that the system is stable. It can have a different population size, which sometimes happens in nature, but it could have the same one as well.
It's somehow strange because I would argue that resilience is actually going back to the initial state.
Correct.
Right?
I want to...
Juan, vamos a intentar, we're going to try to move around, and then if you have things to discuss in more detail, maybe better later, because otherwise we monopolize the...
Yeah, thanks for Paul for the talk. I'm going to be a bit unsurprisingly for the people around here to the data we've got, because you're talking about baselines, though you don't call them that, and about time series data. But one of the things that when you really get into the data, and I'm also a contributor to BioTime, etc. I know the databases, is that we got very, 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 very few data. And perhaps because I was at Silbut at the point we had the GPDD, the Global Population Database, that didn't get to be a success, etc. Or because sometimes when you really look at the data into the analysis you've mentioned, actually what you're comparing is not temporal trends, but it's comparing places that have been affected by the stressor/threat or not affected. Okay, so for example, comparing an area deforested or not deforested. So we are making a time for a space substitution. How much may this have affected your results in the unpublished one, which is the one I didn't know about? Yeah.
So I'm not sure I 100% followed. So let me repeat what you asked. So you are asking about the baseline data, that we do have temporal trends for species exposed and not exposed.
Yeah.
Right? So
because
you have
that data is very scarce. So how do you manage that to get data?
Acknowledging the uncertainty. This is the thing. And this is the reason to be for the first...
but then going a bit back, I mean, what I'm questioning is whether this data is temporal or you're making a space by time substitution. You are comparing...
No,
it's
only
data.
Temporal trends, yes.
Temporal trends. And how have you tried to account for the length of those temporal trends?
Yes.
Of how many years? Yeah.
Yes. So I didn't go into the details of those analyses, but we only include temporal trends or temporal series that have at least 10 years of data, at least. It's not enough. Some people argue that to actually see the effects of climate change, you need 30 years of data. It also depends on the characteristics of the species, because for an ant, for instance, you would probably need less. So this is a very interesting point that we suffer. And I would argue more broadly is that our data, again, is very scarce. We don't have a lot of real baselines. And we sometimes have these very short temporal trends that show a sharp decline, and they can really influence your analysis. In this case, we try to compensate that by just including data sets that had 10 years of data, and at least, if I remember correctly, at least 50% of data points. So it doesn't mean 10 years of points. It could be 5 years of data within a time span of 10. This is an issue. And we addressed this. We didn't see a clear effect when we went above 10 years of data, so the results were very similar. When we were including temporal trends of 5 years, which has been done in some studies, there the issues started to come. Or issues, or let's say sharp differences.
We have time for some more questions, if someone...
Thank you. Very short question. How do you interpret the negative relationship between fertility and resistance? You didn't quite explain that one.
So this one was quite shocking for us. But it has to do with so what we were expecting. We were expecting that species that reproduce a lot would have a stronger resistance, because when you think about population changes over time, the only way a population has to resist something is that when you remove individuals to reproduce and have them. And then they survive and they show a shorter decrease in size, right? That's what we were expecting. But what happens is that there are multiple vital rates related here. Usually, species that have a strong fertility or high fertility, or they produce a lot of offsprings, these offsprings often have a lower survivorship. So what this is happening is that even if you reproduce a lot, very often these let's say, offsprings, it's very difficult to pronounce for me. The babies. So when you have a lot of babies, they usually have lower survivorship, therefore your population doesn't compensate, this reproduction cannot compensate the loss of adult individuals. So sometimes what you have is an in-between situation, so those species that don't reproduce a lot, notice that the relationship was linear. When we were doing non-linear patterns, more interesting things were coming. But when you have an in-between situation where you have a reasonable amount of babies, and they survive enough, then you can resist your disturbance. Does that answer your question? Does it make sense?
I don't know. I was expecting intuitively the opposite relationship. That's why, and you didn't explain, so I was puzzled.
Yes.
So I had not thought about it. It's basically in a way, what you say is that parental effort. So if you have fewer babies, to use your term, you make sure that they survive. If you have lots of babies, it's like a statistical thing, right? You just let some will survive, others will not survive, like the turtles,
exactly.
Right? But both are strategies to ensure resistance. They are just different strategies, right? The fact that you have a lot of babies and you don't care about them, and just let nature take care of them. I hope some will survive. When you have fewer babies and you'll give your life for their survival, like humans do. So that's, I think, there are two different strategies to achieve the same aim. But according to your analysis, having a lot of babies is a worse strategy in terms of resistance. It's counterintuitive, right?
Yes.
So, I was interested in your explanation. You just gave it, and of course, the second question is that: do you think the result is robust? And would it survive more extensive analysis,
I think,
data, etc.? Or would sometimes when you average everything together, you are masking underlying trends, right? So there might be trends that are not visible by just averaging all across. That's a possibility.
Yes, I would argue that there is more nuance there. Also, it depends. You might be very reproductive before the disturbance, but that disturbance might be affecting the very fertile individuals. So for instance, if you think of Semelparus species, which is very fertile, and we include it in this analysis, so it could happen that then a disturbance that is affecting these reproductive stages are being removed, and therefore you see this decrease in resistance, right? Because when you remove these individuals, you are less resistant because you're depending exclusively of these adult stages. But yes, I would argue that there is a lot of nuance to this analysis that unfortunately I don't have the time to analyze, so please. But yes, I would say so, yeah. There is a lot more nuance.
Okay, I think one quick last question.
Thank you. Do you see any difference between different type of species, like urban species or non-urban species or agricultural living species in the compensation or resistance trend?
I haven't presented these results because they are, well, I think there was a lot already there to take. But this is the work of a master's student that I co-supervised while I was at Oxford. And what we have seen is that actually species under more human-developed settings, it also has nuances on to the phylogeny, so which species we're talking. It's not the same an urban bird and an urban amphibian, for instance, an urban amphibian, if there is such thing. But yeah, what we generally saw is that under human-developed settings, species are generally less resistant, they compensate less, and they recover less quickly.
On that note, I think we're going to finish the seminar today. Thanks a lot for coming. And if somebody wants to talk more with Paul, we're going to meet now at the kiosk if it's not raining, because you never know. These last 2 weeks have been crazy. So, yeah, thanks a lot again, Paul.
Thank you.